Why does the Quran insist so often on thinking, reflecting, and reasoning? And why have so many Muslims forgotten this call? In this episode, we unpack Chapter 9 of Zafarullah Khan's Islam in the Contemporary World, exploring how Islam's deep intellectual roots can offer a path forward in today's world. Welcome to this deep dive. We're jumping into a really compelling section of Zafarullah Khan's book, Islam in the Contemporary World. Khan makes a powerful argument here, suggesting that a core reason the Muslim world faces significant issues today is rooted in a kind of amnesia. Forgetting and misapplying Islam's fundamental emphasis on reason and deep reflection.
That really is the heart of it for this discussion.
Yeah.
We're exploring Khan's case. What does he say about the critical role reason plays in Islam, and how, well, in his view, letting go of that intellectual anchor has led to a real disconnect in the modern era?
Okay, let's unpack this foundational idea. Khan asserts right from the start that rationality isn't just some optional extra. It's fundamental to being human, woven into existence itself. And he argues the Quran isn't just okay with this, it actively demands it.
Absolutely. He highlights how the Quran repeatedly praises communities who think, and uses quite strong language, really, to critique those who refuse to use their reason.
Right.
Think about verses like 13.16, which basically asks, are the blind and the seeing equal? Why won't people reflect? He points to this as just one example of many scattered throughout the text, all reinforcing this call to intellectual engagement.
And here's where it gets really interesting. He draws particular attention to Quran 17.70. This verse talks about how humans have been uniquely honored, given special favors above much of creation. Khan's interpretation, which is pretty central to his argument, is that this distinguishing quality, this special favor, is precisely our capacity for reason, our intellect.
And what's fascinating here is how he briefly contrasts this Islamic view with other ways people have thought about reason. He mentions Enlightenment ideas, like Kant maybe focusing on reason as totally autonomous, separate from faith or tradition.
Yeah, that courage to think for yourself idea.
Exactly. And he also touches on modern views that kind of swing between seeing reason as this timeless, objective thing, or seeing it as purely a product of society and history.
But he pushes back hard on the idea that reason is purely an Enlightenment invention, right? He's quite firm on that.
Oh, absolutely. He emphasizes that Islam has its own long, rich history of intellectual pursuit, rational inquiry, contemplation. It's not something borrowed.
Okay.
However, and this is a really critical distinction according to the source, the Islamic view of reason, as Khan presents it, isn't reason as the sole or ultimate authority.
Oh, okay.
Instead, reason is understood within the broader framework of revelation. It works with faith and guidance, not completely independent of it. And that's a major divergence from purely post-Enlightenment rationalism.
So it's not reason versus faith, but maybe reason as a part of a larger reality, intrinsically linked to faith, maybe even moral character.
Exactly. He presents the Islamic perspective as advocating for a different mode of thinking, one where reason is connected to virtue, to spiritual awareness. He even brings in the Prophet Muhammad's description of an intelligent person, al-Qais.
Right, I remember that.
As someone who masters their lower self, their ego, and prepares for the eternal life. It shows the intellect isn't just for, solving math problems, but for moral and spiritual orientation.
And you can see how multifaceted this concept is just by looking at the sheer variety of words the Quran uses for thinking. It's not just one term.
Khan highlights this incredible richness in Arabic. You've got tadabbur for contemplation, deep reflection, tafakkur for active thinking, aql, the intellect itself, qalb, which is fascinating because it's not just a physical heart, but often seen as the seat of understanding spiritual insight.
So the heart thinks too, in a sense.
In a very real sense, according to this view. Then there's ilm for knowledge, fiqh for deep perception or understanding. The source lists so many more: idrak for grasping, shur for consciousness, burhan, hujjah, bayina for different kinds of evidence, hikmah for wisdom. It really paints a picture of a holistic mental process.
It's definitely not just cold logical deduction then. It sounds like it involves different dimensions of the mind and, yeah, even the heart.
Right. It points to a process that integrates empirical observation, rational analysis, moral judgment, and spiritual insight. It's all woven together.
And the source points out if you fail to use these God-given faculties, well, the Quran doesn't exactly hold back.
No, it uses very powerful, sometimes unsettling metaphors. People who don't use their reason are starkly compared to cattle, or even described as more misguided than cattle. That's Quran 25.4344.
Wow.
They're called deaf to truth, even if they have ears, or blind despite having eyes. like in Quran 10.4244, and Quran 7.179 is quite graphic, depicting them as heedless, with hearts that don't understand, eyes that don't see, ears that don't hear, just like livestock.
And 22.46 is particularly piercing, isn't it? Saying it's not the eyes that are blinded, but the hearts within the chests.
Exactly. It shifts the focus from just, physical sight or raw intelligence to the state of the inner self, the orientation of that qual, that heart-mind. Khan also mentions Quranic verses that pose these huge questions about our existence. Are we just here for no reason? Like 23.115 or 75.36. The implication is that reason is for grappling with these big questions.
So we have this deep, intellectually vibrant tradition, emphasizing reason, holistic understanding, all very clear. But Khan makes a significant pivot here. He argues that despite this rich heritage, the attitude of many Muslims today can often appear, well, irrational, unbalanced, focused on the superficial.
That's his central critique of the contemporary situation. Yeah. He suggests that historically, religious scholars, in their necessary work of classifying religious acts, ibadat, formal worship like prayer, fasting developed very clear categories. Fard, obligatory, sunnah, recommended, mustahib, preferable, things like that.
Which makes sense for clarity.
It does. But his point is, applying that same, sometimes very rigid approach to muamalat, everyday worldly dealings, and even sometimes getting overly focused on minute details within the acts of worship themselves, led to a critical problem.
Okay, what problems specifically?
He argues that this intense focus on classification and prioritization, while developing incredibly detailed rules in fiqh, Islamic law, sometimes led to losing sight of the ultimate objective, the spirit behind the action. He sees this as an attitude that becomes, frankly, irrational and disproportionate.
He uses the example of Salah, the daily prayer, to really drive this home, doesn't he?
It's a very powerful and relatable example. He contrasts the true spirit of prayer, that deep conscious connection with God, that intimate communion, striving for ihsan, that constant awareness with what he describes as an excessive focus on, well, he calls them petty issues of Islamic law related to prayer.
Like what specifically?
Things like the exact rules about covering the head or ankles, endless debates over saying Ameen aloud or quietly, or even getting caught up in detailed arguments about the imam's beard length, whether he wears jeans or if he watches TV, the externals.
Right. He observes that sermons or talks about prayer often get bogged down in these legalistic details and rarely seem to focus on prayer as this transformative spiritual communion or the lessons it should teach about justice, equality, brotherhood.
Exactly. He even notes how mosque posters might be like 99% focused on fiqh points, rather than inspiring that inner state of conscious awareness that ihsan.
It reminds me of that tradition he quoted.
Yes, the one from Darimi. Many of those who pray derive nothing from their prayer except weariness and strain. It's quite sobering. And he includes that poignant verse by the poet Iqbal, who describes hearing a voice call him an idol worshiper while he was praying, illustrating that state of being physically present but spiritually completely heedless.
The anecdote about the British-born youth leading prayer is particularly memorable, too.
It really is. Khan describes this young man, dressed unconventionally perhaps, jeans, boots, short beard, leading a prayer that Khan found profoundly moving. He called it beautiful, captivating, saying it had no parallel for him outside the holy mosques in Mecca and Medina.
But he's not using it to criticize the clothes or beard, right?
Yeah. No, not at all. He uses it to highlight the presence of spirit, what he calls the Bilali spirit, referencing Bilal, the companion known for the deep sincerity of his call to prayer. Khan argues this anecdote shows a loss of equilibrium. Sometimes the outer form is meticulously followed, but that inner spiritual dimension, that connection, is missing or gets pushed aside. His point is crucial. The outer form is essential, yes, but the spiritual dimension, the inner reality, takes precedence when you apply reason and look at the objective.
He gives another sharp example of this disturbed sense of priority, comparing backbiting and smoking.
Right, it's a stark comparison. He points out that backbiting, gossiping, speaking ill of someone behind their back is condemned in the Quran in incredibly strong terms, like eating the flesh of your dead brother. It's a major sin.
Whereas smoking?
Smoking, generally, is considered makruh, by many scholars disliked, discouraged, but it's nowhere near the level of a major, explicitly forbidden sin like backbiting. Yet, Khan observes, you often see smokers getting condemned much more harshly in some circles than people who regularly engage in backbiting.
That really illustrates the point about a skewed order of precedence.
Completely. He argues it's a classic case of a loss of rational perspective on the relative importance of actions. Losing that balance.
So the consequence, according to Khan, is this pervasive loss of equilibrium. People end up prioritizing things that are, well, less important over those that are absolutely crucial.
Exactly, like focusing heavily on recommended acts, the Noah-fall, maybe while neglecting the core obligatory ones, the farade, or treating something merely disliked makruh as if it were utterly forbidden, haram.
And this leads to,
He argues it leads to widespread aberrations, a real loss of symmetry and harmony in both individual lives and the collective community life. He quotes the poet Chunkbast, who defined life itself as order in the elements, suggesting that this disorder, this loss of rational priority, is deeply detrimental to a healthy religious life.
and this irrational approach, this loss of perspective, it doesn't just affect personal practice or internal community issues. Khan discusses how it spills over into reactions to external pressures, to provocations from outside.
Yes, he points to the events surrounding the Charlie Hebdo cartoons as an example, as presented in the source material. He describes the publication needing to Muslim protests, which he clearly states is a legitimate right. But then he notes that for some, the reactions went beyond protest, including alleged violent attacks on the publication's offices in Paris, tragically resulting in deaths, and also protests and clashes in other places like Niger, which also led to deaths and destruction.
He mentions the Pakistan National Assembly's condemnation too, framing the cartoons as an attempt to incite violence.
Right. But Khan's specific characterization of the violent type of reaction, based on the source, is that it was purely emotional, irrational, and counterproductive. He uses this as an illustration of what happens when that inner equilibrium and rational approach are abandoned.
And he draws parallels to other events.
He does. The source mentions he cites similar patterns of violent reaction following the publication of Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses, and also after the destruction of the Babri Mosque in India, events which also tragically led to widespread violence and loss of life. Again, he's presenting these as illustrations from his perspective of this recurring issue of irrational response.
So his core message from these difficult examples is,
That in precisely these kinds of challenging, emotionally charged situations, maintaining a cool head and adopting a rational, measured approach is absolutely critical. He argues that letting pure emotion take over, acting irrationally, fundamentally distorts your perspective. You start seeing small things as huge and genuinely big issues as insignificant.
and the warning he leaves us with is quite stark if that doesn't happen.
It is. He states pretty clearly that without making a conscious effort to regain this rational approach, this intellectual and spiritual balance that he argues the Quran prescribes, the Muslim community risks continued intellectual stagnation. It risks being trapped in a cycle of errant, purely emotional responses. And this, he believes, perpetuates cultural deviations and ultimately prevents real progress.
So what does this deep dive into Zafarullah Khan's arguments about reason, balance, and, well, avoiding purely emotional or irrational responses mean for you listening right now? This isn't just abstract analysis. The source really pushes us to look inward.
He's essentially offering a framework for discernment, isn't he? How do you distinguish the core spirit, the objective of an action or belief, from just its external form? How do you tell what's truly essential from what's, superficial? How do you separate objective truth from just a subjective emotional reaction? He presents this kind of careful thinking, this use of reason and reflection, as a core Quranic command.
It definitely makes you consider your own responses. When you're faced with challenging information or a situation that triggers really strong feelings, are you pausing? Are you engaging your reason, your intellect, and maybe that heart mind we talked about in a balanced way?
Or do you get swept up?
Yeah, are you able to look past the surface details, the immediate trigger, and focus on the deeper objective or principle involved? Or do you find yourself getting caught up in the heat of the moment, or maybe rigidly sticking to minor forms without considering the bigger picture?
Khan really emphasizes that maintaining that equilibrium between our outward actions and our inner state, between form and spirit, and crucially, prioritizing the spiritual and the essential when we apply our reason, that's key to a life of meaning, balance, and effectiveness. It really raises the question for all of us about where we're putting our energy and focus.
So let's leave you with this thought, drawing directly from Khan's perspective in the source.
Yes, as Khan argues based on the Quran, reason is indeed a defining human quality. This gift we've been given to guide us. Consider this in your own life. How do you actively practice discerning a response that comes from a place of true understanding and balance versus one that is perhaps just driven by raw emotion or reaction? And perhaps more importantly, what might be the real-world consequences for you and others if you consistently mistake one for the other?